Okay. So, yesterday I said that I said that there is a very clear statement in Marx about the role of competition and why is the mechanism of accumulation is the driving system into of capital as opposed to Keynes. Okay, Keynes breaks with that, and here I found it. I found it on the online which is the Moscow edition online of Capital, and that's the sentence. Okay, so the point in which Marx and Keynes would totally agree, and the neoclassics would not agree. Classics, the other classics would also agree, but they don't have that preoccupation. It's a different Smith and they agree, but their problem is not that of Marx. Marx's concern and focus is the accumulation of abstract capital. You understand what abstract capital means? It is not the accumulation of physical things. It's the accumulation of value form of capital. Do you understand? Capital for the capitalist mode of production uses machinery, uses land, uses labor, uses raw materials, uses things in the process. But the outcome, which has to be continuously reproduced outcome, is abstract value. You understand? Do you understand that? For the individual person, for us, we do not have capital. We are not agents. Most of us here would not be, all of us, I guess, would not be agent of capital. We are not in the process of creating capital accumulation. For us, essentially, whatever wealth, it's essentially made of things. Right? It's made of the things that we can acquire, that we can buy, right? That's for the normal people. In other words, wage earners, normal salary earners, not executives. Then, for capital in Marx is not a thing. It's the accumulation of abstract wealth. Not concrete wealth. It's not a house capital. It's not machinery. Machinery contributes to the process of capital accumulation, but it is not as such capital. Capital is the value form, the value that comes out, which is abstract, because it's value. It's not a thing. It's abstract. You understand? Yeah, it's essentially, Marx is very clear, thanks to Hegel. Okay, that's the Hegelian basis. Marx here is very clear. So that value, wealth in Marx is abstract. Well, this is a point of contact between Keynes and Marx. Keynes also, for Keynes, wealth is abstract. It's non-material wealth. It's money form wealth. Keynes talks about wealth as being the desire to obtain wealth is not the desire to obtain a Rolex watch. It's not the desire to have a Rolls Royce. It's the desire of having monetary wealth in Keynes, which is the same, which is understandable only if you see it in Marxian terms of abstract value, of abstract wealth. It's very important to see that. So, in Marx, this abstract wealth, that's the point of contact. And then this is the partition here. The point of contact is also the point of difference, okay? Now, I don't think that Keynes came to this point of understanding the abstract notion of wealth without a bunch of people circling around him. And this bunch of people circling around him were Piero Sraffa, essentially, and Maurice Dobb. Maurice Dobb was the Marxist at Cambridge, okay? And Piero Sraffa, I'm sure, I'm completely sure about this, would just whisper a few words in Keynes' ear, and then Keynes then would go to Maurice Dobb and say, hey Maurice, is anything you can tell me about this Marx chappie? And Maurice would say something to him, okay? And this is how he got that, because the notion of abstract wealth in Keynes is absolutely very clear when he talks about this. And you don't find abstract wealth in neoclassical economics. There is no notion of abstract wealth. Neoclassical economics is always based on physical things, right? You maximize utility by eating apples, or choosing between apples and pears, and getting the marginal rate of substitution between apples and pears, and that's how you do. Then money is just a medium of exchange, no more than that. So money is neutral. The rate of interest is a real price, okay, which is an indicator of the technique of production and as well as of the income distribution, that is to say the marginal productivity of capital. So everything is physical in the neoclassical world. And the notion of abstract wealth, abstract value simply does not arise. It's simply completely bound in the neoclassical world. So how come that Keynes was totally bred and born and bred neoclassical Marxian, essentially, with Wicksell in it, through the British modifications of Wicksell in his own work on the Treatise of Money? How is it possible that he comes up with the notion of abstract wealth, which is completely Marxian notion, Marx, epistemologically it's Marxian. So how is it possible? That's because he had these people around him, plus perhaps even Bernard Shaw told him something, he was talking to these people, and perhaps even Wittgenstein, if he could make sense of Wittgenstein, I don't know. Then he comes up with it. But for Marx, pursuing the process by which abstract wealth is obtained, it's not an individualistic process, it's a social process. It's a process of capital accumulation, and the capitalist is the agent of that. And here is the sentence, the paragraph from, and it connects with competition. Okay? And here is it. So that's chapter 24 of the Moscow edition, the only valid edition, okay, of volume 1 of Capital. So that's what Marx says about the capitalist, fanatically bent on making value expand itself. He, the capitalist, ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake. He thus forces the development of the productive powers of society. This is the revolutionary aspect, this is my comment, this is the revolutionary aspect of capitalism. Okay? The revolutionary aspect of capitalism is that it brings, let's think in 19th century terms, brings in Marx's own terms especially, the capacity of the human society, of humans to exercise a power over nature to a large extent, up to a point, not totally, but up to a point, and creates those material conditions which alone can form the real basis of a higher form of society. That is this notion of communism, if you like, a society in which the full and free development, etc., we don't care about this. only as personified capital is the capitalist respected, because he's the agent of capital. Okay? As such, he shares with the miser. Okay? The miser, he was a great reader, Marx, of both Molière and Balzac. So, as such, he shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth. That's the miser, right? The miser is the stingy person who wants to accumulate, like Lavar in Molière, for instance. As such, he shares with the miser the passion for wealth as wealth. But that which in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy is in the capitalist the effect of a social mechanism, of which is but one of the wheels. Moreover, the development of capitalist production. Okay, this is kind of preface, and the real thing is here. Moreover, the development of the capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of the capital laid out in a given industrial undertaking. And competition, this is the role of competition, and competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist as external coercive laws. It compels him, the capitalist it is, to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve it. But extend it he cannot, except by means of progressive accumulation. This is the key sentence here. The key sentence is this. Actually, the two key sentences are these two. Okay? This. That the process of accumulation is not something which comes out of individual desires. It is the capitalist. This is why classical economics is so important for Marx, because classical Smithian and Ricardo, they zeroed in on the role of competition. And this comes together precisely in Marx, and in particular in this paragraph here and in these last two sentences. This is also the point of departure with Keynes, because we have, as we have seen yesterday, in Keynes, well, yes, the pursuing, trying to obtain abstract wealth does not necessarily entail a rise in investment. And this is totally independent, because progressive accumulation means a rise in investment, okay? That's what it means. And so in the Marxian framework, whether the firm has, say, $10, €10 surplus after deducting all the costs, etc., so a profit of €10, or it has a profit of 100 million euros. Competition compels the firm to invest them all. That's what it is. Okay? That classical competition, notice, classical competition is not neoclassical competition, which is perfect competition subject to diminishing returns. Classical competition is simply the fact that firms cannot hang on to extra profits. They cannot hang on to monopolistic situations, because there are no barriers, there's free movement of capital, there are no barriers to entry and exit from industries. Okay? And this is the great thing about capitalism, that in the classical, and also Marx, that it compels firms to be always on the frontier of production. Always. And if they fail to be on the frontier of production, they go down the drain. Okay? Right? So, On this principle, Fiat should have gone long time ago. If you apply this principle to Fiat said long time ago, somewhere between the 80s and the 90s, essentially. That should have been the period in which Fiat survived. Why did it survive? Because of the monopolistic position of Fiat, that also gets money from the state and all that sort of stuff. It's not just monopoly in the market. It's monopoly relatively to the state, okay, relatively to the Italian state that does just about everything Fiat wants. Just about everything. Fiat wants to quit Italy, the Italian state said yes. Please quit and give you money for Serbia, okay? Because this is what happened. And so this means that today's capitalism does not correspond. It's not only the case of Fiat, even more so with the United States. The United States, Chrysler should have gone long ago, Chrysler. Okay? So it's the same thing. Whereas what happened is Obama, trade unions, etc., pension funds, they all got together, they called in Fiat. Why Fiat was so interested in Chrysler? Why so interested? Why they were not interested in merging with a bit more successful companies? Chrysler, after all, is not a fantastically successful company in the United States and in the multinational system of the American automobile. Why didn't they try to get some others? Asian companies, which are a bit better, also technologically and so forth, you know. But because behind Chrysler there was the American state. That's the essential reason, okay? Behind Chrysler there was the deal, Obama, with trade unions and with the funds that were managing Chrysler, etc. Behind that there was the American state. So Chrysler was basically covered by the American state under certain conditions. So Fiat went into that. That was, but in any way, if you apply the principle of competitions here, of market competition, Chrysler should have gone in the United States long ago as well. Okay? But what does it mean? It means that there are, in contemporary capitalist system, capitalist economies, there are very strong barriers to entry and exit. You cannot enter easily into industries, you cannot exit easily from industries, okay? This is and the person who really broke the ground, new ground there theoretically, is actually an Italian economist called Paolo Silo Slabini, and he wrote a very fundamental book which is called Oligopoly and Technical Progress. In Italian is Oligopolio e Progresso Tecnico. In English, which has been translated by Harvard University Press in 1962, first edition, 69, second edition is Oligopoly and Technical Progress. And this is the fundamental change relatively to Marx. The fact that the capitalist economy today is not competitive in the classical sense. There are all sorts of other types of competitions, but there is not competitive in the classical sense. Keynes, if Keynes had appreciated this, he would have written a much better book. Much better book. Yeah, I'm sure, but because Keynes left this hanging in mid-air. This issue hangs in mid-air. For Keynes, he focused on the fact that the creation of the pursuing the objective of abstract wealth does not entail necessarily an increase in investment. So increasing wealth does not necessarily mean increase in investment. And this is, however, a very important change, as I said yesterday, relatively also to the classical thing, because it means that if you increase the saving ratio the propensity to save in the economy, because of reasons which are connected with individual type of action, individual, not individualistic, but in individual firms, individual wealth holders, and so forth, it does not mean that the level of investment will increase. So the adjustment will take place how? It will take place through a fall in the level of income. You understand? This is the crucial, this is why the multiplier is so important. I don't think it's important in policy terms. I think the multiplier is important, is so important in policy terms, which this is what happened to what is called hydraulic Keynesianism that came after the Second World War, that they look, okay, just, especially in the United States, let's activate multipliers, let's throw money into the economy, okay, which is okay, just broadly speaking, it's better than not to throw money into the economy, okay, broadly speaking. But it does not necessarily mean that the multiplier, this mechanism will always work. It's the analytical, conceptual aspect of the multiplier which is very important. That is to say, this thing, that when investment is the independent variable, it's the independent variable because of the things that we said yesterday, that is to say, for the fact that investment means equipment and factories and buildings, etc. And these things are not produced, are not being created for tomorrow. They are created for a lifespan which is several years, okay? And therefore it is connected to how how capitalists interpret the future. And since they cannot interpret the future, really they can guess, they can gamble over the future to some extent, but they cannot, it's a bet which they make relatively to the future, but there is no reason why this level of investment should be consistent with the full employment level of investment, okay? With the full employment level of output and therefore of investment. Therefore, investment becomes the independent variable of the system, and any variation in S, okay, if S is constant, income and employment, income is important as a proxy of employment. You can see it if you write Y pi L, which L is the level of employment, okay, in the system, pi is the productivity of labor, okay, so this would be 1S times I, and hence L is 1S pi times I, okay? So this means that that's the real relationship in Keynes. That's the real relationship, not this one. He writes this, but actually this is the important, that's what he aims at. You understand? But if you have if income output is equal to employment times the productivity of labor, it is evident, given the productivity of labor, that any change in investment will determine the level of employment. And any change in S, okay, will also determine the level of employment. You understand that? So, given investment, if S rises, if more wealth is accumulated as a result of increased savings, employment will grow. Now in this we come to a point to a point in Keynes. He, I think, is the one who first came up with what later has become known has been Christian described as fallacy of composition. Fallacy of composition. Okay? So you say savings, because savings are connected in one way to investment. You say, well, if savings rise, investment will rise, and that's the story of classical, and in a different manner, also neoclassical economics, so the Mixelian mechanism, okay? But Keynes says, no, if savings rise, First, if savings rise, then nothing happens to investment. Employment falls, output falls. Okay, therefore the Fawcett composition. Don't think that an act of saving by an individual firm or an individual, by a single firm, by a particular firm, or by any individual, that an act of saving will generate additional investment. In order for the act of saving to not to become a recessionary factor, it is necessary that somewhere investment should increase. Okay, and in fact it should increase more than savings. Yeah, because if this increases, employment falls. If this increases just to offset the increase in S, employment will not change, will remain the same. If an increase in savings has to lead to an increase in employment, then investment should increase more than the increase in the propensity to save. Okay? In other words, the propensity to invest should be always higher than the propensity to save. It's evident here. This is the Keynes. That's the strong point of Keynes' argument. And then people like a guy called, but people said, okay, but this is because you don't bring the rate of interest in. If you bring the rate of interest, then rate of interest means cheaper loans, and people will borrow, companies will borrow more, and this is, so increasing savings, that's a second mechanism, reduces the rate of interest, okay? If the rate of interest is reduced, then you will have an increase in investment, because cheaper. Keynes says, well, Keynes here is a bit ambiguous, but basically says, look, it's like a football player that looks for a corner solution, okay? Saves the whole thing by kicking the ball in the corner, and he says, well, but there is liquidity trap. Okay, now it so happens that today it's okay, the liquidity trap is fine, because today the rate of interest is zero and investment is not rising, so you cannot have loans cheaper than what they are now, okay? Because the rate of interest is zero, and banks are not, but go now to a bank and ask for a loan, they won't give it to you, okay? The rate of interest is zero, but they are not lending. It's very difficult to get the loan, and also for companies. But companies are not interested in borrowing. They are not interested, companies are not interested in borrowing unless they want to borrow to pay debt. Okay, to pay debt. And the banks know this. Well, I am not going to give you money to pay debt. So, but you're kidding me. Yes, I'm kidding. Okay? But because to pay debt means that you are not creating, you relieve your patrimonial situation improves, but doesn't improve. You don't produce more if you pay debt. You understand that? So banks also don't want to lend because they don't want you just to pay debt. They want you to expand, to expand based on expectations concerning future rate of profit, future return. Future returns are extremely uncertain, except in the financial sector. So banks lend to each other, really, that's what happens. They lend to each other in order to find ways through derivatives and all this sort of abracadabra. The abracadabra economy operates pretty well now because they have derivatives, they have all sorts of financial products that feed upon themselves, and they are supported by the state, you know, because if Bernanke says, okay, I'm out now, finished, you know, that the whole thing will come down crashing. But,
You said it like...
Bernanke, you know, our friend, Bernanke. The whole economy works on Bernanke, anyway. Bernanke is the chairperson, the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the United States, yeah? If Bernanke said, look, I'm out, I'm moving out, not himself, I mean, now it will be Janet Yellen. If she says, you know, I'm pulling out, I'm tapering, as they say now in jargon, tapering, you know? Taper off, to taper off. That is to say, I'm no longer feeding banks with money. in the case, in the particular way they do it in the United States, then the whole thing will come down. Okay? That's why Larry Summers said, look, we need to get a new financial bubble going, because otherwise we are stuck. That's why, this is why when he was in the running to get the chair of Bernanke, and because of that, actually, that ensured that Janet Yellen would get it. Because it was a very sort of cold-blooded statement to say, look, financial bubbles are essentially good for us because we don't have any other means. And he was completely right. He is completely right on this. Now, so Keynes says, look, there is liquidity trap. However, this retreat by Keynes onto the liquidity trap opened the way to the big transformation that Keynes would not have wanted of his own economics into what is called the neoclassical synthesis. That is to say, the transformation of Keynesian economics, which was really a fight to it's like somebody trying to come out of a psychological state, you know, struggling to going to the psychoanalyst in order to come out of a psychological state in which one finds himself trapped. And Keynes, the trap was the quantity theory of money and the Wickselian methods, which are connected anyway, okay? The quantity theory of money, whereby money is neutral, does not affect the level of output and employment in the economy. It affects only the price level on one hand, and where in the Wicksell-Robertson mechanism, where cycles and also unemployment and these sort of things is determined by the disequilibrium between savings and investment. And Keynes says, no, there is no disequilibrium between savings and investment. Savings and investments are always equal, macroeconomically and in accounting terms, they are always equal. How do they equalize? If, right? So, if to the fact that investment is the independent variable, so it's the driving element in the system, and any change in the propensity to invest, in the percentage of investment of propensity to save, any change in the saving ratio in the economy will be adjusted by changes in and employment. Okay? Therefore, if the saving ratio rises, given the level of investment, output falls, employment falls. This is the important point of Keynes. So, saving is here to bring equilibrium between savings and investment. There is no rate of interest. It doesn't show. The rate of interest is irrelevant for the relationship between savings and investment. You see that? The relationship between saving and investment is not determined by the rate of interest. It is determined by the multiplier effect, that is by 1 over S times I. You follow? There is no rate of interest entering into that. Okay? So there is no supply function of capital through savings, which has to meet a demand function, cross a demand function for capital represented by investment. You follow? There is no such thing in Keynes. But when they asked, they told him, look, but with the rate of interest you will make things easier because investment falls, investment rises, loans being cheaper. Keynes said, yes, but we can have liquidity trap. So he said, yes, there is a whole range in which this happens, which is a static range, okay? But we have a liquidity trap, below which rate of interest does not affect investment anymore. Okay? You understand that? Now, how does he get to the story of the liquidity trap and all? He gets it simply by establishing, and this is neoclassical. See, this is he cannot get out of his neoclassical. He cannot get out because that's what it's like. You know, for instance, if you like to read in another language and you don't know that language, well, you wish to read that language, you may start studying the language, but then you still think in the older language, in the languages you come from. And the same thing is in Keynes. You know, he had all these people around him, but he was thinking always, his analytical apparatus in his head was essentially neoclassical. So he establishes here the rate of interest, he establishes here the level of investment, okay? And he gets this. We already found this curve in the wage rate of profit from here. This is what he calls it the marginal efficiency of investment. That's what he calls it. Okay? And of course here, the lower the level of investment, the lower the level of the rate of interest, the higher the level of investment. Okay? You follow me? So, and he writes it in the general theory, he has that. In the book he has that. And but then he says, okay, but we have here a situation whereby there is a point here, this area, where if you reduce, so this curve ceases to exist. If you reduce the level of investment, the level of the rate of interest, if you reduce it, okay, it's like this. You don't have any more, investment will no longer increase. That's the liquidity trap. Okay? Yes?
What drives investment after the liquidity trap is started? So it's independent, but it's like what does it determine its very good level in Keynes?
The various level of investment.
Yeah, you say that output adjust to investment.
Yeah.
But
investment is always exogenously given.
Exogenously, he doesn't say anything
about No, because he has chapter 12 of the general theory, we talked about yesterday, in which he says investment is determined by the state of long-run expectations. Okay? And the state of long-run expectations cannot be defined because on yield, on prospective yield, but the state of long-run expectations cannot be determined theoretically. There is no mechanism because he has the subjective probability theory that operates there. And yes, this is his big story about uncertainty, or what Paul Davidson, who is a well-known post-Keynesian in the United States, Keynesian economist, calls it ergodic, non-ergodic, this type of stuff. Okay, forget it. And it's basically that the future cannot be known and cannot be probabilistically determined. You know, like you determine risk premium in insurance and so on. That's the big thing of Keynes. So, a guy, a very, very good, I mean, this is the thing that I don't read textbooks. I never read a textbook in my life. You know? I glance through to see what they tell, but I never read the textbook in economics in my life. And I always read the original. This is what this is thanks to the both Italian university and Italian liceo, where you read classics, you know, so you read the real thing, you know, you read Tito, you that's what, don't read the summary of somebody else's textbook on Tacitus, you don't read the textbook, you read the actual thing, you know, and so, or Aristotle, you read Aristotle, don't read somebody else, you know, and then so, and it's commentaries, of course. Now, there was a guy called John Hicks. John Hicks got the Nobel Prize from Oxford, got the Nobel Prize in 86, I think, or something. John Hicks, actually Sir John Hicks. John Hicks. John Hicks began this, what is called in the literature the neoclassical synthesis. That is to say, to put neoclassical economics into Keynes and to reabsorb Keynes into neoclassical economics. Keynes wanted to break away from neoclassical completely, okay? And John Hicks wrote in 1937, Econometrica. It's in the readings that I gave you, that you find. Econometrica 1937, he wrote a very, very important paper which is called Mr. Keynes and the Classics. Mr. Keynes and the Classics. Classics meaning the neoclassics, okay? When we talked about classics and also Keynes, but Keynes, everyone before him was classics. Okay, from Ricardo to Cell, and to himself, to Keynes of 1930, when he published the book Treatise on Money, which he then rejected, okay, and changed. So everyone before the general theory was a classic, except Marx here and there, yes and no, depending on what Raphael Daub will tell you, okay, or Virginia Woolf and Bernard Shaw, because he was in constant, especially Bernard Shaw was hammering him. Bernard Shaw considered himself Marxist, and therefore he would just keep writing to him, you know, you must read Marx, you must study Marx, and he kept writing. So he says, I've read the general theory. Okay? I've read the general theory. I don't understand. He's not wrong. It's not that easy to understand general theory. It took me many, many years through different routes. So, to understand what I understand, because people understand me, understanding other people in a different way. So, and he says, but what I get, the message I get from Keynes' general theory is that there can be a situation of unemployment independently of price not being perfectly market-based. That's the crucial point. Hicks understands that. Hicks understands that unemployment in Keynes is not due to the fact there are price rigidities in the market. Okay? Because I can give you a quantity, price and quantity diagram, and I can set the price above equilibrium level. That's it. The diagram will immediately tell you where that there is a situation whereby markets don't clear. The market doesn't clear, right? If you set the price above equilibrium in a supply and demand diagram, and you have any supply and demand diagram, you can put whoever you can put here, you know. That's the price, and this is the quantity. You can put here any type of good you like, a goat, you can put a donkey, you can put Airbus plane, you can put whatever you like, you know, and you have a supply and a demand. This supply and this demand. If I put the price here, this is the equilibrium, okay, level. This is the equilibrium price here. If I put the price here, you can see immediately that that's the gap, okay? You can see the gap. You can see that I produce less than the equilibrium, less than the potential supply. You can see it immediately if I put the price level above, right? The equilibrium. Therefore, I can say, well, this is due to prices not being, whatever situation in which there is no market clearing state, I can ascribe it to the fact that prices are rigid, as they call price rigidity. Prices are not flexible for whatever reason, because there can be trade unions in the labor market, because you can have monopolies in the product market and so forth, prices are not falling to the equilibrium level. Okay? Likewise, I can say if there is a situation of inflation, I can put the price here. You can see that the price here, this price here, would be an inflationary price because it's below equilibrium level. So I say, okay, you want to get rid, just rise, just let prices, so here can be subsidized prices, for instance, subsidized prices, like they were in the Eastern Europe, in the socialist countries, there were fixed prices, so, and you should let prices be determined by the market, they will rise to equilibrium, and that's fine. Basically, this is what all economics is telling you, in one way or another. Neoclassical economics is distorted. Okay? Doesn't matter how they go around it, they can go around it with stochastic process. Stochastic means random process. They can go around it with all sort of dances. But this is the story, okay? This is the story. Higgs understood in Mr. Keynes and the classics, he understood that in Keynes the issue is not price flexibility, price rigidity versus price flexibility. And this, as I pointed out yesterday, comes out from the Hansen diagram of Keynes. Okay? You have demand and output being the supply, and you can see that if the full capacity level of output is here, and the full capacity level of demand is here, so PF, YF, anything below defines a situation of excess capacity or unused capacity and unemployment. And yet the system is in equilibrium. Supply is equal to demand. Output, all the output which is produced is actually sold. All the output does not mean all the productive capacity. Okay? So Higgs understood that in Keynes the issue of unemployment, because that was his main concern, through the determination of the level of income via the multiplier, that in Keynes the issue is not connected to price rigidity of markets not working well. In Keynes, markets always work well. Okay? In Keynes, he says it in his book, I don't have any reason to doubt that the individual firm, business, fails to do the right thing. I don't doubt that they actually do the right thing. That they do all the right calculations. That simply they do not have a general equilibrium view of the market. They cannot have. So they will react to, adjust to what the level of effective demand is perceived to be. That's all. But within that framework, they do all the right thing. So he did not doubt the capacity of the entrepreneur. It's not a matter of the entrepreneur not being able or being monopolistic or being, see? Higgs understands that. Okay. Therefore, what happens here in Keynes is essentially, I'm not going to construct the entire ISLM model because he came up with the ISLM model, which is a standard model used in macroeconomics everywhere. It's a silly to use it as policy terms. But it's not silly to understand Higgs' position. So what basically it says, okay, in Keynes we have a situation whereby the economy is trapped in a range which he calls it the liquidity trap range. Okay? So I understand the economy would be a completely neoclassical economy. So he basically has investment, what he does, he makes investment inversely related to the rate of interest, well, like Keynes in the marginal efficiency of capital, okay? So investment and the rate of interest operate inversely, okay? Then he makes savings positively related to the rate of interest. This is Wickselian, completely Wickselian. That is to say, savings rise if the rate of interest increases. Okay? It's more inducement to save. And outside the liquidity trap, the system is neoclassical. You see how he brings Keynes into neoclassical framework. When the system hits the liquidity trap situation, which is determined by the money market, I'll tell you in a second. When the system hits the liquidity trap, then the system becomes Keynesian. That is to say, investment is not responsive to changes in the rate of interest. Okay? You understand? Okay. So, Keynesian economics, the economics of Keynes, to be more precise, becomes a subset of general equilibrium. That is to say, of a neoclassical interpretation or neoclassical view. Because outside that, savings and investment are brought into equilibrium by the rate of interest. Because savings are the supply of capital for investment. If the rate of interest is high, savings rise, so that the supply rise. Okay, and then the rate of the investment is inversely related to the rate of interest. So investment is a down-sloping curve, and savings is an upward sloping curve, and they will meet at the point they are brought into equilibrium by the rate of interest. So that's neoclassical Wickselian, traditionally Wickselian.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I didn't understand the liquidity trap at all. Can you
The
explain?
liquidity trap is that range. You see here we have several rate of interest. Okay, 1, 2, that's the rate of interest, and several level of investment. Okay, so the liquidity trap is that range of the rate of interest below which the investment will no longer rise. That if you bring the rate of interest further down and we truncate the curve here, okay, so we truncate the curve, there will not be any further increase. Investment does not increase any further. If you bring it down here, investment is still here. Okay, that's the liquidity trap.
That's because there is not enough money for everybody who wants to.
No. It's because
It's not zero. Why is not zero the bound, the limit, the level?
Why is not zero?
Why is not zero?
because Keynes assumed that there is a range that wealth holders, money holders, therefore those who have money, okay, when they see that the level of the rate of interest is low but doesn't have to be zero, okay, then they will decide to hold money in cash.
Is there a preference for liquidity?
That's right. That's what I was about to say. The liquidity preference. They have a preference for liquidity against a preference for investment, for investing the money. You understand that?
It's an assumption, kind of, in his theory. I mean,
It's a behavioral assumption. It's an assumption about behavior, how holders of
So the owners of money decided that it's not useful to invest more?
yeah.
And
No, they decide not to buy bonds, not to put money into interest-bearing activities. Can be bank account as well. The bank account pays you an interest rate which is 0.5%, okay? And then you've got all the fees that you have to pay for the banks as well, the services. Well, rationally, is that now we are compelled to use banks for many other things. So even with that sort of very low interest rate and paying fees, in fact, we need to keep accounts in no interest paying, even having a cost for us, because many things require just bank payment and no longer cash payment. But in principle, if you have an account which does not pay a rate of interest that covers, gives you something and covers the cost, then you would prefer to keep the money in the mattress, right? Keep the money at home, keep the money in liquid form. So that's the liquidity preference. So he says, the situation of recession, the situation of recession creates a liquidity preference. It creates a preference for liquidity because investment demand evaporates in a situation of recession and interest rate falls, and it may fall at a level in which it's preferable to hold money rather than buy interest, putting it in the bank, buying interest-bearing bonds, etc. This means that the money available for loans will shrink, which is what it means in Keynes' view, which is also a bit neoclassical here, by the way, because really Keynes should have worked much better with pure credit money, that's endogenous, totally endogenous money. And that also has been developed actually by Rizal himself, and in Italy and France has been developed by a guy called Augusto Graziani in Italy, and in France by Alain Barguès, a bunch of people called monetary circuit, where money is completely endogenous to the system. It's not gold, it's not printed by the central bank, it's not a stock of money, it's completely generated by the bank, by the credit system in the economy. Now, but leaving this aside, so Higgs says, okay, there is a range, in Keynes there is a range in which the economy does not perform because investment, the rate of interest is in the liquidity trap area. So how can we make the economy perform? Well, that's the area in which fiscal policies become dominant. Because the only way in which you can push investment is by creating demand through government expenditure. Because the rate of monetary policies don't work in the liquidity trap zone, and the only way in which you can work, it may work, is by government expenditure. Because notice that in Keynes, government expenditure and investment can be added together. You understand that? They're perfectly additive. You understand? Government expenditure. No?
No, it means that they're the same.
They're not the same. They can be added. You can add to.
So they lie on the same.
Exactly. They are in the same space.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Why? Because Keynes looked at investment as expenditure. So as demand creating factor. You follow? So you follow that? But just this you can think in terms of a company, textile company, that has to order new machinery. So the textile company does not produce the machine. There's a two-sector model. One is the textile company, which produces the consumption good, produces socks. We eat socks, we do everything with socks. Okay, so it's a simple consumption good and needs textile machinery. So the moment it places an order in the machinery industry, then that order means that the machine industry will have to produce the new machine, but therefore it will employ the people that have to produce the machine in its factory. Okay? So if there is a new order, additional, that has to be incremental, delta order, then investment, what is investment for for the textile industry, it's production for the
Machine.
machine industry. But where does this come from? Who thought in those terms? Adam Smith did not think in those terms because he has core models. That doesn't happen.
It's right.
Ricardo did not think in those terms because he also has the core model. Who thought in those terms? Charlie. He's the one. Charlie, volume 2 of CAP, volume 2. It's already in volume 1 in words. But in analytical terms, it's in volume 2 of Capital. It's called Mass Schemes of Reproduction. Okay? That he saw it. And you know what generated? You cannot. It's like you cannot move out of Marx. If you talk about Keynes, you go back to Marx every time. You know, because Marx is completely central to the physics of economics. As I said, it's like Newton. Keynes is Einstein, but you will not understand Einstein unless you first know Newton. Okay, so you must know Newton, which is Marx here, and you know why Marx? What was the factor that made Marx develop his own schemes of reproduction? Which he gets actually, the idea he gets it from the physiocrats, from the French physiocrats. But the factor that really said, okay, I have to build this input-output model, that was the development of railways in Britain. Because with the development of railways, he realizes that in Britain, and throughout most of the 19th century, not most of it, but till good part, till the first part of the half of the 19th century, in Britain, in all over the world, not just in Britain, every company had its own, was called workshop, it was called atelier, workshop, where they produced their own kind of machinery. With railways you cannot do that. Yeah, with railways is a complex system. So you cannot have a railway company producing locomotives on the side, etc. It's impossible. You know? The type of complexity that the locomotive requires, the machine, etc., requires a machine sector. Okay? So when Marx sees the development of railways in Britain, and Marx was reading everything, was reading the reports, the technologies, everything, he was mad, right? So when he reads all that stuff, he said, a machine sector is needed to develop, you know, that, and he comes up with the schemes of reproduction. So for him, the machine sector producing for railways becomes the machine sector for the economy as a whole, right? Yeah? And conceptualize the machine sector for the entire system. Yeah? Yeah. And it was proven right. You know, it was proven right. Number by the United States development after the Civil War. Because until the Civil War, the United States was what? Was a kind of half a plantation economy, you know, cotton and that sort of stuff. But with the Civil War, it becomes an industrial economy afterwards. Development of railways, development of steamships, which is even more. And then he was dead by then already, or the development of Germany. Germany was industrialization from above, right? Industrialization from Krupp down, not from down to Krupp, okay? And Thyssen, Krupp down. Huh? Yeah, from Krupp down to Bismarck. Yeah? And who copied Germany? Two countries that became strong, big industrial countries. You know, two countries copied Germany. One is Japan. Japan copied Germany precisely. This is precisely. The Japanese know how to copy exactly. They copied German. Even today, you go to Japan, in the schools, they dress like Prussian little children. You know, in the schools, they have uniform. But they copied Germany. They translated and the other country was Soviet Union. That was the model, the reference was Germany, in terms of industrialization, capital good industry first. And that's, okay. Anyway, so in the range of the liquidity trap, therefore, the Keynesian system works, the fiscal policies work. Yeah? So, government expenditure is exactly like if government expenditure, the government builds a bridge, public works. Or if the government builds a bridge, it has to create a bid for companies to build the bridge, and therefore this means materials, investment and stuff like that. Government can do other things, be it airports, roads, and all this. This is called government expenditure. So it's government expenditure in physical, in real terms, okay? And it's exactly the same as investment from the point of view of demand. And the third element, which Keynes did not bring in the book, because the book is global theory and therefore it doesn't look at specific cases, conditions, but another guy who was from Cambridge, and he was one of the people who were talking to Keynes when he was young then, called Richard Kahn. So Richard Kahn, he developed the export multiplier. That is to say, you can also export. Yeah? You can also have an export multiplier. That is to say, instead of depending on your internal demand, you depend on external demand. And the only thing is that the only difference is that while every single country can boost its internal demand, not every country can boost export. You cannot have all the countries export. They can all export more, but what counts is net export over import. And by definition, unless they start exporting to Mars or to Jupiter, by definition, by accounting definition, all world export must be world imports. You understand? Not every country can have an export, a net export position. You cannot have. By definition, the net exports must be equal to imports. Do you agree? Not for each country. World exports must be equal to world imports. In fact, they are the same thing. World exports are world imports. You follow? You understand? Therefore, the export multiplier cannot solve, if the problem is a world problem, the export multiplier cannot solve the problem. If the problem is only for some specific situations, specific number of countries, then the export multiplier may actually give you room for expansion and recovery in employment and so forth. But if it's a world problem, like the depression of the 30s was a world problem, like today it's roughly a world problem, not China, it's roughly a world problem. Not so much Asia, but it's... However, even today, you cannot expect that every country, there are so many countries like the European Union, which are in recession and unemployment. There are countries which are not necessarily in recession, but they have still high unemployment, like the United States. You cannot expect all those countries to solve the problem by export, because there won't be the equivalent of imports. By definition, it's a zero-sum game. Okay? So he didn't talk about it. He talked about export as a solution, but as a solution for particular countries, not as a general solution. Okay, now another 10, 15. So Higgs is the person who brings in neoclassical, because the whole system is neoclassical, except in the liquidity trap. You follow? But there is still an important element to appreciate in Higgs, that he realizes that Keynesian unemployment is not due to price rigidity, and in particular is not due to wage rigidity. Okay? Because again, in the standard neoclassical framework, which in Cambridge itself was put forward by a guy called Pigou. Pigou was the head of the department. Pigou was a socialist, by the way, and he was a socialist. He also wrote a very little good book on socialism. And he was also among those people, you know, that in Cambridge, this is what I'm saying, why I'm stressing this, because I'm stressing, why do I say, all of a sudden I say Pigou was a socialist? Because neoclassical economics is not an apologetic theory of capitalism, of the capitalist system. Neoclassical economics is based on methodological individualism, and it assumes, its objective is to create a framework where you can see, you can get the best you can possibly get, okay? Some kind of Pareto optimality, so to speak, with no one being forcing a power relation on somebody else. Okay? So neoclassical economics epistemologically was not born as a justification of capitalist relation. There is no capitalism in neoclassical economics, so how can it be a justification of capitalism? But it later became, in the post-war period in particular, an element of justification of markets as they are out there. But neoclassical economics as such is not necessarily a justification of markets as they are there. Okay? And so Pigou, for Pigou interpretation, he actually wrote a book on unemployment, not in the 30s, but in 1912 or something. For him, unemployment is the result that in the market there are rigidities, and they are expressed also by wage rigidity. This is where they become, this is okay, you say that you are not apologetic, but how come that always the problem of unemployment is on the wage? You get? You understand? So why is it, if you are not apologetic, why don't you come up with something else where the problem of unemployment is not entirely the fault of the wage? So in the Pigou's framework, unemployment is the result of the price of labor being above the equilibrium level, so that the wage rate is above the equilibrium price. Okay? Like apples and pears, exactly the same. Hicks understands that this is not in Keynes. In Keynes, unemployment can happen even with wages being perfectly flexible, but this is because of the liquidity trap, which blocks investment. Do you follow?
So Hicks realized that investments and unemployment is not dependent to what?
Hicks realized that unemployment is not determined by wages being rigid, not by wage inflexibility. Because it is investment, it's the liquidity trap area which blocks investment. Okay? So prices can be completely flexible within the liquidity trap area, except nothing happens. Okay? This is the Hicks point. Okay? And then the war comes and no one thinks about it anymore, because this is 1937. So the war comes, no one thinks about it anymore. Okay? So we stop here for the break. So after the war, this is after the war. So as I said, the war comes and that's it. We don't talk about that stuff anymore. Well, in any analytic. The issue of the war is very important in understanding many things that are related to no longer the economics of Keynes, because then Keynes, he dies in 1946. But it is very important to understand the political economy of Keynesianism, of how Keynesianism became the mainstay of economics throughout the 50s, 60s, and collapsed in 1973, around 1973. So, Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, Keynesians. Keynesianism migrated to the United States essentially after the Second World War. And this has to be understood. So I'll try to explain this now. It has migrated to the United States in the form of the so-called neoclassical synthesis. And it happened essentially somewhere between, in the first 10 years after the Second World War. Not immediately, but in the first 10 years, by mid-50s. And the reason why it took such a long time, it is because the main preoccupation, okay, after the Second World War, the main preoccupation in the United States was that the Depression would come back. Because what got the United States out of depression? Initially were Roosevelt policies, which could be considered sort of Keynesian. Roosevelt, not immediately, but 1932 he was elected, unemployment was 25, 27%, 26% in the United States. Output was down by 50%. Industrial output and etc. So initially when he was elected, he was quite conservative because the first thing that he did when he was elected, he cut the salaries of all the government employees. But then, as the economy was not getting out by itself from the recession, then he started implementing what we could say Keynesian policy. Keynes was in correspondence with him. He was corresponding with Roosevelt. So he started to implement quite significant one, Tennessee Valley Authority. It's a very important project, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Tennessee, south of the United States, southern United States was underdeveloped, right? Totally underdeveloped because it remained essentially plantation economy, but with no slave labor. Okay, so it was totally underdeveloped, poor. And he introduced the Tennessee Valley Authority, which developed Tennessee quite significantly. He introduced electrification programs throughout the United States. Okay? Because the United States did not have an electricity grid. There was no electricity, there were local areas, but he introduced the global electrification, which is a complete national grid within the United States. So plus the Social Security system came in, which did not exist before, plus the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which means that meant that all the deposit today would be less than up to $120,000 or $100,000 are protected, that is to say they're immediately funded. So he introduced all these sort of things. And the economy did recover quite significantly under his tenure. But then he went back he got scared. And also he was under attack from conservatives, like Tea Party today and stuff like that. So they were under attack from conservatives, and he went back to try to introduce, to achieve, and he did achieve balanced budget. He did achieve balanced budget. The result was that the economy slumped again. It was the second slump in 1938. 1938 was the second slump, with unemployment shot up again to 19%. Okay, 19% was. Depression was 25, then managed to unemployment to fall to 12%, so still very high. And then when he balanced the budget, you know, like the Tea Party people would like to see today, when he balanced the budget, the economy slumped in 1938. It's called the second slump in the literature. So what really got the economy out, the American economy out of the depression, was the real Keynesian program represented by the war. The war was a major Keynesian program. That's what it was. The war represented what government expenditure, because it was all financed by government expenditure, the war. Government deficit in the United States during the war was 25% of GDP. The deficit, not the debt. The debt was 130, 140%, 120%. It's all in the economic report of the president. There's a very good statistical appendix. And if you go, and it's online, and you can see the US debt during this deficit during the war, internal public deficit, was 25% of GDP. Okay? But nothing, there was no inflation, there was standard of living were increasing. Actually, the United States is the only country, because during the war there was full employment, also in Germany, by the way, you know, including the soldiers that were drafted into the people that were drafted into the army. But what I'm saying, but in no country involved in the war, consumption increased during the war itself. In every single country, consumption fell because everything went into armament production, into the industrial inputs for armament, and so forth. The only country in which consumption increased was the United States. In the United States, consumption during the war was above consumption that was during peacetime, during the 30s, okay? Except for cars. Cars could not be purchased. There was a complete ban on production of cars because the entire automobile industry was transformed into producing engines, planes, trucks, and all that sort of stuff, tanks and artillery and so forth. So that was the big Keynesian. That's what G, you know, in the Keynesian equation, that's what happens. You know, basically you have output, investment plus consumption, okay, plus government expenditure minus taxes. Well, that's, you know, that kept growing. Taxes were not increased, okay, and government expenditure kept growing, and it went into General Motors, it went into McDonnell Douglas Corporation, it went into higher wages. Wages also increased. Part of the wages were frozen into compulsory bond purchases, okay, so there was forced savings. But wages were increased, wages increased very significantly during the war in the United States. And consider that in the United States, when the army was mobilized, they expanded the army, but they had to take soldiers and they took it on most people from factories, right? And so the issue came up, this issue of, well, where do we get the workforce to operate within the factories? And okay, so the solution that was given was, there were two solutions. The one solution is to draft women into the factories. They raised the question, but women, until then, women did not work in factories, very few, except some textiles, tobacco industry, traditional areas where women workers. existed, but otherwise you would not have. And there were not very many women doctors also going to universities and stuff like that. So where do we get all these things from the civilian population, civilian workforce necessary to keep the economy going, to keep the society going, etc.? Well, drafting women into the factories showed that there was absolutely no problem. Productivity did not fall, because that was the unskilled labor as a result of the fact that women were not working before and in factories, but nothing. The productivity went up, so there was no problem. The second is how much we should expand, the Americans should expand the army. Okay? By how much? And there was a big debate. The issue of 90 divisions relative to 125 divisions. It's a very good book by University of Los Angeles, UCLA historian. I think he moved to some East Coast university. Very good book, which I find the title because I did not read it. No, I tell you why, because it's 1,200 pages. 1,200 pages. But I gave it to my students in another course. And I said, and I organized groups whereby students had to read chapter by chapter and write reports. So I have the reports of that book. But I also listened to a conference, the national radio of Australia. It's called Radio National. What they do, they have a very simple program. They look at seminars in universities, and they go around, and if they find an interesting seminar, they record it. And they transmit it, they broadcast it. So I was one day washing the dishes, and then I had the radio, and I hear this talk by this professor of history, whom I did not know of him, called I think David Kennedy. And Kennedy for sure, whether it's David or not, I don't know, I don't remember. And this professor of history giving this talk at the University of Adelaide. It was broadcast on the radio. I took down at the time the name. The university, that was I think 2000, so there was already internet. That's crucial because they put the talk on internet, on the web. And then I got the students read the book. Okay, so I had, and the talk was about his book, so he summarized the book. It is very interesting. It's called, the draft title, I'll find it, it's called The American People in Peace and War. So it's a very Tolstoy type of title, right? In Peace and War. It's inverted, in War and Peace. It's Peace and War because in the 30s it was peace and in the 40s it was war. So it cannot be war and peace, it's peace and war. So, and it's a fantastic research that he has done. And what he said, what made it possible for America to have an expansion of consumption during the war? Every other country had a fall in consumption. Not to speak about Soviet Union, which was half destroyed, and the European part was more than half destroyed, and half destroyed also the Siberian part. The fact that what made it possible, that he says, there was number one, the decision by Roosevelt to put the war planning was not in the hands of heavy industry. Heavy industry, steel, production, etc., wanted the heavy industry wanted to be the leaders of the planning of the war, right? Because they have to produce steel and planes and aluminum and all this sort of stuff. For Roosevelt put the head of the planning committee for war production, the head of socks and underpants. Yeah. Sears, which is a major Chicago, you go to Chicago, where the Sears Towers, that belongs to the towers, the two big skyscrapers. Now it's the biggest, the tallest in the States after after the World Trade Center came down. And they were the chief of a department store. Like Macy's, like today would be, what's the one, the famous one? The famous one, which is famous. It's famous because it sells everywhere in the United States. What's the name? It's famous. It is the largest employer. There's 1.2 million employees.
Walmart.
Walmart, that's right. They put Sears managers in charge of war production. Why? Because Roosevelt did not want to have a fall in consumption. So because Sears, they actually sell underpants and bras and socks and all that sort of stuff, well, clearly they did not want to have that thing squashed, right? They wanted to keep the business going. They wanted to actually profit out of the war to have business going. So there's one. They raised the issue. The debate was, heavy industry was in favor of complete mobilization during the war, complete militarization, right? Complete. So complete militarization meant, technically speaking, according to this book, 125 military divisions, 125. But then these people from the department store said, with 125 divisions, we won't have people to work. It will not, even if we draw upon women, we will not have enough workers in the factories, especially also for the production of consumption goods. So we cannot have 125 divisions. Maximum 90 divisions. So 35 division less. Okay? It's a big thing, 35 division less. Okay? But how do you face two fronts? Number one front at that time was the Pacific front, and then Japan. So how do you face that? 90 division was not a sure thing. Okay, solution. We produce planes. Just produce planes. Just bomb. Okay, as much as you can. Produce planes. Huh? But that was not enough. Second thing is, let's have the Soviet do the fighting. That's what comes out from that book. It's very clearly stated, it's not just second. So everything depended on Stalingrad. The argument was, if the Germans win at Stalingrad, we must go 125 division. There is no possibility. Okay, it's impossible, but we must go. If the Soviet, as it happened, win in Stalingrad, which is actually, the thing came not really in Stalingrad, came a bit later, came in after Kursk, because the crucial battle in the Soviet Union is not Stalingrad, it's Kursk, okay? The battle that really changed the war's position is not Stalingrad. Stalingrad is the emotional thing, the first defeat, but the strategic change is the Battle of Kursk. And which happened in July 1943. But then, with the Battle of Stalingrad, they said, okay, it is possible to aim at 90 division only. 90 division allowed the economy to develop consumption. That's the crucial thing. And this is the people, the managers of these department stores, okay? So they ran huge deficit, consumption developed. Fantastic, okay, fantastic. In the end, what did they got? 450,000 people died, plus, I would say, usually 4 million perhaps wounded. 450,000 Americans, soldiers died. So the total number, civilian casualties in the United States, 6. 6, as a result of a balloon that came from Japan. Japan started to send balloons, started to send incendiary balloons across the Pacific to fall on Seattle, to fall on San Francisco, but only one made it. And when it came down, when it got tangled, and it was full of explosive, when they tried to bring it down from where it got tangled in trees, etc., it killed 6 people. It's basically. like 60 million casualties, 450,000 military personnel dead, and usually it's 1 to 10 that sort of are wounded, so I would say 4 million wounded would be roughly, but usually it's 1 to 10. Soviet Union, 22 at least, 22 million, okay? Certain areas of Soviet Union, like Belarusia, more than 60% of the population was killed. So the disparity is enormous. The disparity is enormous, but it's enormous also in terms of the war effort, because essentially the German army died in this, okay? Died in Russia. The Nazi army died in Russia, not anywhere else. It's in Russia that it died. And so, when the war ended, they said, okay, they realized, the Americans, that there was the possibility of a recession, that the depression would come back, right? Because the soldiers get demobilized, they stop getting the money. You don't need more guns and airplanes. You already had plenty of airplanes. You know, they had, by the end of the war, they had, 10, 15,000 airplanes. So there was possible. Ships, they had thousands of ships, transport ships, battleships, etc. So all this demand falls with the end of the war. Because the good thing about the war, if it doesn't destroy your industry, is that the plane gets shot down, you see, and you can replace it. Yeah? And this is production for McDonnell Douglas, it's production for... You know, Ford made huge amount of money, not just from the American war, not from Ford, General Motors. They made a lot of money through the German war. You know why? 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 Because they were...
They were providing them considered.
They were General Motors factories like today, Open is General Motors, right? It's American, Open. And there were General Motors factories in Germany during Nazism. And therefore they produced for the Wehrmacht. Huh? They produced tanks, they produced trucks, they produced all this, so they made money. It's not the Nazi government paid for. It's not that they were Americans.
And
IBM was, they had a big deal. IBM had an excellent deal because they were providing the computing machine for Nazi concentration camps. Okay? Yeah, because they all these people in the concentration camps, you have to have, the Germans are always very precise, so they have to have records, they have to have everything, so they need computing machines, and they had IBM. So, all this was, but this, so the Americans made a lot of money out of the war. Yeah? The demand for that stuff was over by the end of the war. End of the war means no longer that. Soldiers are coming back, they don't get the pay from the government anymore, hence recession. That was a recession. And the recession did not come. It came, depression did not come. A recession happened, but depression did not come. But in that period, if you look, American Economic Review of Economic Statistics, if you look at the American journals, the obsession with the coming back of the depression is very big. So they were concerned about this thing. That was their main concern. Will the economy relapse into depression? But the depression did not come. And at that point, they said, oh, why is that the depression, why didn't it come? They didn't ask why it did not come. Economists did not ask why it did not come. The depression did not come back thanks to something else, thanks to what is called the Cold War. That's why the Depression did not come back because NATO, Marshall Plan, that was another big thing. The Marshall Plan was a big. Then they had to, with China becoming communist, mostly because they feared that China, Mao Zedong did not want to break with the United States, okay? He did not want. But the Americans interpreted Mao Zedong as being just one thing with Stalin, and the result was that a Cold War developed between the United States and China, and with China becoming communist, they became completely paranoid, totally paranoid, and they took Japan on board, right? Because until 47, 48, the Americans about Japan, they were not so warm about Japan, about rebuilding Japan. When China became communist, immediately they rebuilt Japan. Okay, they really rebuilt Japan. They did to Japan things after they bombed it and destroyed it. They did things that they have not done to just any other country in terms of in positive things, restructuring Japan completely, putting Japan back into operation completely. So, against also to the strict economic interests, they did those sort of things to Japan, which later they extended to Korea via Japan. Then Korean War came. Korean War was very big Keynesian story. Korean War was not a small war. It was a very big war, not as big as the Second World War, but was a very big war on a small territory. But there was a very big war, the Korean War. The Korean War was, and that was the major. So this is the factor that prevented the return of the relapse into the depression. And this is the factor which convinced the American economists that the economy was by itself managing not to relapse and managing to grow. You understand that? Why I'm stressing this factor of war? I'm stressing the factor of war, and I could stress other things, to climbing the Everest or whatever, but what I'm saying, I'm stressing the factor of war because war generates a type of demand which is not calculated from within the business. The business sector does not think in terms of let's supply a war, but only if the war comes, yeah?
So, like, technically speaking, not giving any moral consideration to war, a war now would be as kind of like the other solution over the bubble, financial bubble, like would be the other possibility.
Well, it is. Some wars developed by design, like in the case of Hitler, or in the case of Japan toward China, etc. Some wars, like the First World War, did not develop by design. It developed by like tectonic movements that clash, and they cannot be mediated and okay. But wars don't develop out of economic calculations, out of business economic calculations. They are not the result of micro decisions. They are not the result of the utility functions where we factor in war as part of the utility, of the argument of the utility function. What I'm saying, wars generate external demand. They are like exports. You follow? You don't produce for domestic production for the war, in the war. You produce military hardware, planes, etc., which get destroyed at some stage, all right? And it doesn't get back into domestic production. It's outside. So it's like exporting. It's like exporting to the moon. You export to the war. You follow me? And you are financed by the government. This is what. So this is why the United States did not relapse into the depression of the 30s. Economists in the United States started to say, well, the market is doing it. Okay? But there was clearly big government expenditure as well, so they said, okay, and this is Paul Samuelson. This is to say, we are therefore in a mixed economy, government expenditure and free market. And so they put Keynes into that framework. So because government expenditure was so important for Marshall Plan, American government expenditure was important for Marshall Plan, was important for the Korean War, was important for just about everything that was happening then, for the reconstruction of Japan. The reconstruction of Japan is American expenditure, it's not something else. And therefore, they could not deny American the role of government expenditure. So government expenditure is a fiscal policy in the context of a free market economy. And that, the neoclassical synthesis of Keynes became the dominant form of policy in the United States. Okay? And, actually, we still have more than half an hour. So how this dominant form of policy took place? First, they started analytically. Now we're going back into economic theory. Okay, we're going back, but now we are all in America. We left Europe, weeks together. We are in America and we are happy, etc. So, because in America everybody is happy, we are happy, and so on. So how it happened? It happened in two ways. First of all, there was clearly the very ideological purpose. There was a very precise ideological purpose. Precise ideological purpose was, okay, we have a mixed free market economy, which means government expenditure plus private enterprise, which was to be set up against Soviet planning, China communism, doesn't matter. Okay? All that stuff there. Soviet Union, China. So it was also presented as not only the alternative, but the way to answer to the challenge. You understand this? What I mean? So Soviet Union planned economy, China more or less was considered to be something like a China planned economy, People's Republic, and therefore that is the answer. So free market, mixed economy, government intervention can give you full employment without need for planning, and especially without need for public ownership, without need for nationalization, without need, you have private enterprise, like in the USA, everything is private, always been, public health, except for social security, stuff like this, but otherwise, everything is private. Right? So that's okay. So we don't need all that stuff. We don't need Stalin, we don't need Mao Zedong, we don't need all this. Which they extended it also to say we don't need Nasser, we don't. They extended also to other, okay, not just Mao Zedong and Stalin and so forth, which was quite, or Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. So that was, but then they really believed in the policy mix. They really believed that you can run the economy in terms of a policy mix, okay, based on 3 steps. First step, so you are in an airport. You are in an airport and you get onto a plane. You get onto a plane, what does the plane do? But after it closes the door, of course, it taxis, right? It goes to the runway, so it goes. This is ISLM, short-term full employment policies, okay? You understand? Because it's the mix between monetary and fiscal policies when you are not in equilibrium, full employment, you are not in full employment equilibrium yet. You taxing toward, so you decide that the range in which you can have fiscal and monetary policies. You understand me? Remember that Hicks put Keynes fiscal policies in Hicks are in the Hixian version of Keynes. Fiscal policies can happen when you are in the liquidity trap. But In 1944, Franco Modigliani did his PhD in the United States. He had to quit Italy because of the racial laws by Mussolini that he passed in 1938. So he went to the United States, studied at the New School for Social Research in New York, and got his PhD on the basis of an article that he published before the PhD. The article has become the seminal article. Absolutely, it's a 1944 article in Econometrica, in which he says, okay, Hicks tells us that Keynesian policies are possible only in the liquidity trap areas, okay? However, by and large, the rate of interest is not in the liquidity trap. You follow me? But we have unemployment. We cannot make it unemployment and interest rate coincide in the liquidity trap area only. So we have situations of unemployment also outside the liquidity trap. By and large, unemployment exists also when the rate of interest is not in a liquidity trap. Do you follow me on that? In Hicks, you have liquidity, the Keynesian policies work only if you are in a liquidity trap. Because then you have fiscal policies. You have the only way to expand is by having government budget deficit, okay? Because you are in the liquidity trap area. If you lower rate of interest, monetary policies don't work. It won't have any impact on the economy. But Modigliani says, listen, this is not the general situation. We have unemployment also when the rate of interest is not in the liquidity trap area. You understand? We have unemployment also when investment is sensitive to the rate of interest. So you follow what I want to say? Therefore, we cannot go. If you have unemployment, if you have fiscal policies working only in the liquidity trap area, it means that you are in a very special case, because by and large, the rate of interest is not in the liquidity trap area. But also when the rate of interest is not in the liquidity trap area, we are going to have the problem of unemployment. So, in other words, monetary policies may not necessarily work also when you are outside the liquidity trap area, when you are above the liquidity trap. So, and he says, why is that we have unemployment also outside the liquidity trap? Why do we have the need for fiscal policies outside the liquidity trap? Not just in the liquidity trap. This is Modigliani. We have the need for fiscal policies outside the liquidity trap because wages are rigid. Do you follow? If there is wage rigidity, labor markets don't adjust. Supply and demand for labor does not reach equilibrium. Neoclassical, totally like apples and pears. And I'm not going to discuss why that is discussing, but I'm not saying that this is bad because wages are not flexible. I'm saying that the fact that money wages are not flexible is a fact of life. It's a fact of life. It's not something that we can question. Okay? And he explains in his Econometrica paper 1944, he explains why this is a fact of life. Because wage contract, well, the price of an apple and a pear can vary between today and tomorrow. Okay? A wage contract is established over a certain period, for instance, over a year, 2 years, and so forth, and therefore the money wage doesn't vary during the wage contract. Do you follow? Therefore, money wages are institutionally, by definition, by the nature of the contract which defines money wage, which determines money wages tend to be rigid. So we cannot impose upon wages the same flexibility that we can impose on apples and pears, the price of apples and the price of pears. This means that outside the liquidity trap, labor market will not clear. Okay? So even if you move the rate of interest, etc., there is no guarantee that labor market will clear. So you get full employment. Hence you need fiscal policy. In other words, you need a mix of fiscal with monetary policies. Okay? That's what you need. Modigliani. Now, then we get now to this 1944. 1956, we get to 1956. Okay. So with Modigliani, with the Modigliani-Hicks model, we can establish the short-run policies of full employment. You establish the policy mix between fiscal and monetary, depending on the conditions. If you have to operate on the rate of interest more than on the budget, or more on the budget than on the rate of interest. This is the ISLM framework. So the model remains essentially neoclassical with this kind of condition. So the plane now has reached the runway because we are ready to take off at full employment, because in the short run we bring the economy to full employment. We now have to bring the economy to keep the economy at full employment. One thing is to bring the economy to full employment. Another thing is to keep the economy at full employment. They are two different things, right? You understand? You follow me on that? Okay. Example. I give you an example, precise example. Assume that the economy is made of two goods only. Okay? There are the tractor drivers and the factories producing tractors. Assume the factories producing tractors. For reason of simplicity, I assume that tractors produce tractors and the tractors produce the wheat with which you have the bread, and that's the consumption. Okay? So, assume now that you reach full employment and you are in a country like Sweden. What is the population growth of Sweden? Zero. Zero, possibly negative. Okay? But by and large is zero. Or Italy, zero. Zero population growth in Italy, except for immigration. But we exclude now immigration now in this moment. So, we bring everyone to full employment in the short run. But we have factories, we have tractors that produce tractors. So, with some of the tractors will have to be taken away because they are old, right? Because of wear and tear, of depreciation. Okay? But if the capacity, the productive capacity of the factories producing tractors is above the depreciation level of tractors, the next year, with full employment, the factories that are producing tractors will produce more tractors than you can have tractor drivers to put on the tractor, right? Because, you understand, population is not growing. Through Modigliani and Hicks, we have the policy mix by which we get to full employment. So all the factories are factories, offices, secretaries, everything, everybody, universities, everybody is fully employed. But the productive capacity of the economy can take us further because we can build more buildings, we have brick industry, we can produce more bricks or cement, and we can produce more factories, we can produce more tractors. But we don't have the people. You follow? Because everybody is full employed. We don't have the people. Solution. Now, so we call people from abroad, okay? And this is essentially what happened during the long boom with migration and so forth. We can call people from abroad. Okay? Right. This is one solution. But this is a solution ad hoc, because it's not a theoretical solution. We have to come to a theoretical solution of the problem. But the theoretical solution of the problem is that either we are back into a Excel world, because in the Excel world you don't have tractors. Capital is perfectly jelly. It can be, it's called malleable capital. That is to say, if we produce more capital, okay, than what we have labor, then the price of capital should fall. Capital is perfectly malleable, it's homogeneous, it's malleable, so it's a kind of a jelly thing. And the capital intensity of production increases, capital is cheaper. The technique of production moves toward more capital intensity because we have produced more tractors, okay? But this time, if we drop the assumption that you have one tractor driver to a tractor, then you simply have more tractors per head, okay? The capital intensity of production increases, and you assume that the tractor is like a jelly sort of thing, that you can make it adjustable to the existing workforce. That's Excel, but in a growth model. And this is Solo, what Solo did, okay? This is what Solo did. You understand? That's a Solo growth model. That is to say, if you have an increase in the quantity of capital, tractors, relatively to labor, because you are already at full employment, so you have an increase in the quantity of the tractors relatively to labor, well, in a context of homogeneous capital, Excel type of capital that we discussed, then you simply should allow the price of capital to fall, the marginal productivity of capital therefore to fall, capital intensity, and the system settles at full employment at a lower growth rate. It's a lower growth rate, okay? Because marginal productivity of capital is fallen, etc. Lower growth. I made this example with zero growth rate of population, but if you put growth rate of population into the system, that's what you get as an equilibrium condition. Okay, that's it. So the capital intensity will adjust to the full employment growth rate of population. That's the Solo model. That's the plane is taking off, and the growth rate is determined by the Solo growth model. That's the second ingredient of the policy mix. Third ingredient of the policy mix comes with Paul Samerson and Bob Solo, article in 1960 in the American Economic Review, which is, they also called it the menu of choice. Okay, so we have now taken off and we know what is our speed, which is the growth rate of the economy, okay? We know what is our speed. We have taken off on the basis of the Solo growth model. But we have to know at what altitude to fly. At what altitude? 6,000 meters, 10,000 meters? Okay, it depends on the plane, but there is also a range within which we can decide. 8,000 meters, what is the altitude? Well, Solo and Samuelson tells us that the altitude of the flight will be determined by the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay? The trade-off between inflation and unemployment is called the Phillips curve. But it's not the statistical Phillips curve, which is Phillips curve.
Yeah, the trade-off between
Inflation and unemployment. The statistical Phillips curve simply relates changes in wages to unemployment. This is what Arthur Phillips did, which is in Marx already, as we explained, in the Reserve Army of Labor. Changes in, that was a statistical study on the United Kingdom between 1864 and 1951, somewhere. What Samerson and Solo do, they transform the statistical Phillips curve into a policy curve, into a policy tool. You follow? Because they say, okay, if I want to get out of this, I want to get out of this. Because they say, okay, I'll just say it in words. If there is a relationship between changes in wages and unemployment, okay, we are transforming the relationship between prices and inflation, in other words, price changes and unemployment. Why? Because they put in a cost-based pricing. So they assume that they therefore consider that changes in money wages, okay, affect prices, and changes in money wages, okay, are related to the rate of unemployment. You understand that? So, if unemployment is lower, money wages will rise because workers have more bargaining power. The rise in money wages will translate into higher prices. This is a hybrid. Theoretically hybrid. Okay? It's not right. This is not right. It's theoretically hybrid because then you must have a price theory which is not neoclassical, which must be a cost of production price theory. Okay? So they create this hybrid situation. Okay. And they say, okay, therefore you must tell us, policymakers have to tell us what kind of inflation they want, at what kind of inflation or at what rate of unemployment they want to fly. That's the altitude. You follow me? The altitude is that you want low inflation, you must have a higher rate of unemployment. You understand? You want to have low unemployment, you must accept very low unemployment, you must accept a higher rate of inflation. And this is the policy-based Phillips curve. So, short run, Hicks, Modigliani, ISLM gives you full employment in the short run. Meanwhile, you calculate your solo long run growth rate, you put the plane on this, gives you the speed at which you fly. The altitude at which you fly is determined by the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And that's it. In the long run, it's very important, the solo model in the long run is RICSEP. It's a general equilibrium GDP, one sector model. That's what it is. It's RICSEP. So in the long run, they are completely neoclassical. They assume market clearing conditions in the long run. The problem is how to make the plane take off. Okay? So that's the ISLM, which gives you short run, full employment. The long run growth, once you have secured short run full employment, you put the model, the economy on the solo growth, you get the speed, the cruising speed. The altitude determined by the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Okay? This is the neoclassical synthesis. This neoclassical synthesis was the mainstay of American economic thinking till the mid-70s. And from the United States, everywhere. It is in textbooks, it is still today, it is in textbooks, everywhere except one person who was in Chicago. And it was all by himself. And it's Milton Friedman. The Milton Friedman said in the mid-60s that, and he said something right, he said, but why do you assume the Phillips curve to be stable? He said, just about everything else he said I disagree with. But this he was completely right. People, because this is all done, the ISLM solo growth plus Phillips curve trade-off is done by technocrats. They are really planners in a free market economy through fiscal and monetary policies. That's what it is. Right? The market remains private, except everything is private, but through fiscal and monetary policies, they have basically become planners of the macro aggregates, essentially. And this is all done in the cockpit. This is how it's done. Okay. Milton Friedman comes and says, "Hey, but there are people out there, in the neoclassical sense, that is agents. There are agents out there. Agents have rationality, neoclassical rationality. So they optimize something. They optimize under constraint, they optimize diminishing marginal utilities, all these things that we know, right? And they think rationally, that is, they think according to neoclassical economics. I don't agree with that. But he says these agents will develop, you set a certain trade-off between inflation and unemployment, say 4% inflation, 3% inflation, and whatever, 4% unemployment, 3% unemployment. In the United States, that was basically 2% inflation, 3% inflation, and 4%, 3% unemployment. Who tells you that you are going to be in that trade-off? Why should that relation be stable? Because people have expectations concerning inflation, right? And the Phillips curve shifts because they will react to that. They will decide whether to offer labor, whether to supply labor. They are all individualistic, okay? So in the classical economy, you decide whether to work or not, to offer, to be on the labor market and to supply labor. So on the basis of that trade-off, they will have expectation augmented Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shifts because of the way in which people absorb that kind of information, and they will decide accordingly. So they will factor into their own expectations the rate of inflation. On this basis, they will calculate the trade-off between working, supplying labor, or not supplying labor, the work-leisure trade-off. So that's what determines the position of the labor market in neoclassical economics. It's a trade-off between work and leisure. You decide whether to supply labor or not. And this calculation will change the position of the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve shifts. It doesn't stay there as a parameter. And in fact, it will shift upwardly, which means it will tend to become vertical, where there is no more trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That's what he says. He said it in the mid-60s. Yeah? No one paid attention to what he says. Because you ask, I am CNN, okay? So he is Modigliani and you are Milton Friedman, okay? So I'm asking, what do you think is the long-term position of the economy? They will all say exactly the same thing, like Ricardo and Marx, okay? They will say exactly the same thing. They will say the long-term position of the economy is determined by Valrasian general equilibrium. That's what they will say, okay? That is, they will say by the market condition, by perfect competition, market condition, which is Valrasian general equilibrium. Okay, so in the long run, the economy is driven by neoclassical perfect competition. In the short run, you have that. But Milton Friedman comes in the mid-60s and says, and throws a big span into the wheel from Chicago and says, well, folks, that ain't necessarily true, because people have individualistic agents, they have expectations, and they will therefore work upon the information that you give them. You give them information of a certain trade-off, etc. They will not necessarily take it as parametric. They know that there is inflation. They will not take it as parametric, and they will recalculate everything. The result will be that that your curve shifts. And as your curve moves, you cannot have a solid basis to establish your policy. Okay? That's the Milton Friedman thing. And I'm still Milton Friedman. I truly don't believe in this business, in this bull story of trade-off between inflation and unemployment. I really don't believe. If you ask me my opinion, not my opinion, Joseph, okay, not Joseph, I'm Milton Friedman. Okay. And I do not believe in that because People are essentially rational in the neoclassical sense, okay? They are utility maximizer under constraint and so forth. They believe, look, America is so big. America is so big. There are so many firms. There are so many companies. It's going to be competition. So they believe in perfect competition. That's what Milton Friedman. People believe in perfect competition because look, America is so big. No one can really form a monopoly in this. So this, they will be rational, optimizing and therefore maximizing agents, believing in perfect competition. They will not believe your story because they know that what determines the rate of inflation is the supply of money. You follow me? They will not believe your story that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation because they don't believe in the fact that wages determine prices and determine therefore inflation. They will not believe in that. Wages are determined in the free interplay in the market according to all the principles of supply and demand. You tell them a story in which they will not believe, they will calculate everything, they know, they therefore come to the conclusion that you are going to generate inflation and therefore they will shift, they will make the Phillips curve more sticky, more vertical, which reduces the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And that is Milton Friedman finishing time. So this is Milton Friedman, 1960. No one paid attention to it. Yeah? No one paid attention to it. But this is why you cannot explain economic policies without real history. But then, by the end of the 60s, because you should see what Paul Samuelson, the MIT people who were the ISLM, Solo, and the whole were writing. They were writing in Newsweek. Paul Samuelson was writing in Newsweek, and etc. They were saying, "Hey, fantastic! Everything is going very well. Only financial conservatives like Milton Friedman or kind of dogmatic Marxists don't understand that the mixed economy really works. Really works. And by the end of the 70s, it did not. By the end of the 60s, it did not work. It all came down crashing. And it came down through what? Through 2 or 3 factors. Number one, Vietnam War. Number one was Vietnam War. It came down to the Vietnam War. That was the factor that unhinged everything. And why? Because the Vietnam War was very good for the United States, fantastic. You know how many planes the Americans lost in Vietnam? 3,000 planes they lost in Vietnam. They were shot down by the Vietnamese. North Vietnamese Air Force. 3,000 planes. It's Soviet missiles, okay? But they were shot down in Vietnam. 3,000. That's fantastic business for Lockheed Corporation, right? Because this is why Afghanistan war, the previous Iraq war, they are not working. They are not Keynesian war. They are not good. They generate expenditure, but they don't generate a multiplier. The expenditure on the Iraq war goes into the pocket of Halliburton, goes into the pocket of the subcontractors there. They looted everything, but they doesn't generate a macroeconomic multiplier. Whereas Korean War generated a very important macroeconomic multiplier for Korea, for Japan, and for the United States. But the most important Keynesian multiplier after the Second World War was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a fantastic thing. Not for the Vietnamese, because they had 3 million people who died, but was a fantastic thing for American business. Because they lost nearly 100,000 people to begin with, okay, the Americans. American soldiers nearly 100,000, so it's not that it was a big, easy thing. And eventually they lost the war, but American business did fantastically well. Japanese business did fantastically well. Taiwan business did fantastically well during the Vietnam War. Because all of South Vietnam economy there was no South Vietnam economy. What kind of South Vietnam? There was no South Vietnam economy. It was all sustained, supported by American expenditure. The American budget, the South Vietnamese budget was American budget, essentially. And exports, who exported to South Vietnam? Not the Americans. The Americans exported soldiers, jeeps, and Coca-Cola. Yeah. But who exported to South Vietnam? Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. Yeah? And in order to keep all this business going during the Vietnam War, in order to keep the alliances going, the Americans also subsidized, sustained investment in Taiwan, investment in South Korea, opened their own markets to Taiwan and to South Korea. They did a lot of things in that area which generated the Asian tigers, so to speak. But it ended because it created essentially, first, a major cleavage in the United States. So the United States society was being completely torn apart. There was almost a civil war situation in the United States, especially young generations did not want to serve in the army in Vietnam and so forth. So that was a complete crisis in the United States. And secondly, because the rest of the world, thanks to this big American spending, the rest of the capitalist world was also in a boom. Europe was in full employment, etc., and there was this flood of dollars outside the United States. Countries like France, Germany didn't say anything. Germany was not allowed to speak, because it was not allowed to speak. Now they speak, but this after 1991. But then, actually 1990. But then they were not allowed to speak, so they didn't say anything. But, so France said, I don't want all these dollars here. These dollars, said de Gaulle, and his advisor, Jacques Rueff, generate inflation. So, you see, they had a monetarist view, the French, of the world economy. So if you have a lot of dollar, Banque de France has to change them into French francs. And the rest of the countries, Germany also accepted this view because these dollars were flowing also to Germany. They were actually being positioned in Luxembourg, in the so-called euro-dollar account. And not euro today, euro-dollar were the dollars that were circulating in Europe. And they said, okay, we don't have faith in the dollar anymore. Okay? So it created what's called today a credibility problem in the dollar. So all these sort of things started to work. And when you have this situation working, drip, 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 eventually the system shows cracks. And so there were expectations about the American not being capable to sustain these sort of things. There were expectations, therefore, which were speculative, both on foreign exchange markets, which were not open markets, but there was a pressure to open them because it was the view that America would not sustain them. And secondly, the third element, there was expectations concerning prices of raw materials, because the world economy was still booming, and so there were expectations concerning speculation on raw material prices. Why? Because if you think that raw material prices are established in dollars, right? Raw materials are traded in dollars. They are not traded in euros or yen or yuan and so forth. They are traded in dollars. So, if you have expectation that the dollar is going to devalue, right, and you still have a booming economy, that you have expectation that the demand will keep going for oil and for raw materials, what you're going to do, you start to speculate on the fact that the dollar is going to devalue, right? And you try to speculate on the possible rise in raw material prices as to offset the devaluation of the dollar. That's what happened. And then the final thing was the 1973 war in the Middle East, which created the mechanism, the excuse, if you like, for the increase in oil prices by 2 times, 3 times, and so forth. And this completely killed Keynesian policies. Yeah? Because in that stage, Keynesian policies, especially in the United States, were not seen to be working. Budget deficit were not the result of expansionary policies, but budget deficit were the result of economic contraction. So the policy mix was not working. Okay, which was used as a referential system was not working anymore, and that collapse generated the new macroeconomic view based on rational expectation. And I will talk about this tomorrow. Perhaps tomorrow we'll do one more. Do you have time till 1 o'clock instead of 12? Which is? Yeah? Okay, we'll do it till 1 o'clock. Okay. Right, bye. I also have to copy 3 hours.